Hello, my name is Cole Anderson, and I'm your host here on The Independent Pianist. Welcome back. Today I'm going to be talking about a pretty controversial and enigmatic figure in the piano world. That is the Hungarian pianist Irvin Nyiregyházi. The idea of doing a video about Nyiregyházi was originally suggested to me by my good friend Joseph Youngen, who is a wonderful pianist and educator. It's also thanks to him that all of my piano videos where I play myself now make use of well-tempered tuning as opposed to equal temperament. I'm quite hooked on it now. So anyway, thank you for the suggestion, Joseph. I went down quite a rabbit hole after you suggested that I look into Nyiregyházi some more. I listened to a bunch of his things. I still think I'm kind of a neophyte about this guy. I'm getting to know him. I haven't listened to everything thoroughly, but I have listened to most of his later recordings from the 70s and 80s, and I've also dug up some of his piano rolls and some of his things from when he was really in his prime, and it's been a very interesting experience. I'm not going to go too much into his very lurid and sensational life. There's plenty of sources where you can find out information about that. I'm mainly just going to confine myself to discussing the musical merits or demerits of his playing, as the case may be, and the majority of the video in the last part is going to be basically a kind of debunking, if you like, of his legendary recording of Liszt's Vallée Dobermann. And I have linked that in the description box so you can hear the whole thing if you want to and read people's comments below. It's quite interesting, actually. Nyiregyházi's performance of that piece is very entertaining in its way. It's definitely works best if you already know the piece quite well, and I've heard several different more standard recordings, so you might want to go out and listen to Claudio Arrau, Sviatoslav Richter, Lazar Berman, Alfred Brundle, Vladimir Horowitz, a few different people playing the piece if you really want to get the full impression. Now, I won't be coy about this at all. Personally, I very much hate this recording with a passion. About 98% of it, I think, is absolutely wretched piano playing, and no one should ever try to play like this. I think that the hyperbole that's spouted about Nyiregyházi in YouTube comment sections is ridiculous. For instance, you hear quite frequently that, oh, this must be the way that Liszt played, or this is probably what Anton Rubinstein sounded like, or whatever. And I think that that's a very ludicrous idea. I mean, it's probably a little more reasonable to say that it might sound a little bit like Anton Rubinstein, but I imagine that Rubinstein, even at his messiest moments, would probably have had more going for him with his chops than Nyiregyházi does by the time he was making this recording. And of course, it's understandable, actually, that Nyiregyházi was in such terrible shape technically, but that's not even the main reason why I don't like the recording. I can definitely deal with wrong notes, and it's not a problem if the performance is great enough. For me, this performance is just very sad because you can detect traces of a once majestic personality. There are moments where I found myself saying, wow, that's really beautiful or extraordinary in some way. Now, if only everything else was anywhere near the same level, we would have something really amazing. And I get the feeling that most of the people who really like Nyiregyházi's playing in repertoire like this are either cueing in to these kind of traces of this personality that's really quite majestic and forceful, but maybe also to a certain extent they're being impressed by some effects, some piano effects, which are actually kind of shallow and meretricious. Nyiregyházi just tends to bang out as much as he can in the low registers and fill every chord out that he possibly can. And, the first time you hear it, it is quite impressive the way that he does it. But it doesn't always work equally well every single time. And after the 50th time that you've heard him do something like this, you start to realize, okay, he doesn't have much else that he actually does. So moments like this, for example, really turn me off a bit. To me, there's a kind of indiscriminateness about how he uses these sort of techniques, which is really a shame. So to follow up from that idea, there's nothing particularly special about the way that he connects with the individual work for the most part. He tends to just apply his style of playing to every piece, whatever the composer has marked or whatever there really is going on in that music. So from my perspective, it's all manner and no substance, all style. He basically plays everything in the same way. Now, having said this, there are other recordings out there that paint a bit of a different picture. You can hear him playing excerpts from several Liszt pieces, including the Mephisto Waltz and the Spanish Rhapsody, in clips from some B movie in the 1940s. And, over the dialogue and the kind of weird thunder effects in that clip, you can hear that he really is a fantastic pianist. So beyond that, I also have to say that there's a couple of his later recordings which I actually found to be very beautiful. The first Legend by Liszt and several other quieter, more reflective pieces, including the Evening Bells from the Christmas Tree Suite, as well as Abschied, another late Liszt piece. And here he really plays with a lot of beauty and magic. So I wish that there was more of that in many of his other recordings, but I haven't found that to be an evidence for the most part. Whenever the music gets above a certain dynamic level, things just go totally out the window as far as I'm concerned. Also, I just want to elaborate a little bit more about why it's not very reasonable to compare his playing to Liszt or even Anton Rubinstein. And that's simply because anyone who spoke about Liszt's playing and heard him live talked about the enormous nobility and restraint of temperament that he really displayed, especially in later years, as well as his extraordinary clarity of sound. In fact, there's a famous quotation from Charles Halley that this clarity of sound never deserted Liszt for an instant, even in the most complicated textures. There was a kind of superhuman quality to Liszt's kind of transcending of the piano, and I don't think that's what Nyiregyházi does at all. In fact, Nyiregyházi is very much chained to the piano. All of his effect is based on piano effects. And whatever you could call Nyiregyházi, I think clear or lucid is definitely not an adjective that applies to his style, at least insofar as I've heard it so far. Now, it might be a little bit closer to compare him to Anton Rubinstein. In his later years, Rubinstein was known for catastrophic memory slips and for reorchestrating the music he played for the maximum effect of sound, huge craggy sonorities. But he was also well known, and it was remarked by very intelligent listeners like Rachmaninoff and Paderewski, that he could really pull large-scale structures together into a very cohesive whole, no matter how many wrong notes he played. And this is something that, to my ears, Nyiregyházi actually rarely does in his later recordings. Rather, he seems to be all about the enjoyment of the moment and taking pleasure in his kinds of colossal sounds, irrespective of what came before or what's coming after in the musical discourse. So this leaves kind of an unfortunate taste in my mouth, and it doesn't impress me from the musical perspective very much. So his manner in Vallée d'Opperman is not only at odds with the score, but also at odds with Liszt's spirit, insofar as I or anyone can understand that from studying his works. The nobility of sentiment, this kind of beautiful inner world is totally absent. Instead, we have this kind of unsettling abyss, a kind of a wasteland of pianistic indulgence. So again, a little disclaimer, please don't hate me if you happen to really like Nyiregyházi. I do think there are great things in many of his performances, and even in this one, and I'm going to point them out as I go along. And I do think he must have been an incredible virtuoso at one point, fully worthy of Arnold Schönberg's praise. Arnold Schönberg said some very interesting things and complimentary things about him after hearing him in the 40s. He wrote a letter to Otto Klemperer, which is reproduced in the wiki article, but I also put it here for you. And these comments really support the notion, based on his earlier piano roles and selected performances in movies, that he was really something very special. And it's really a shame that we don't have anything from him when he was in his prime, playing all of his his repertoire. It probably would have been really amazing and something that I would have gotten a lot of pleasure out of myself. So let's go kind of bar by bar and listen to what's going on with Nyiregyházi's playing and why I personally don't like it. So the first thing we can note about this opening phrase is that Nyiregyházi plays the first eighth note practically like a half note. This does rob the theme of its kind of odd limping quality. It becomes very square and heavy. This is actually not an unusual mistake from my point of view. It's a mistake to make. But Nyiregyházi really exaggerates it to such an extent that it's impossible to even tell what the notated rhythm would be. It's also worth noting that this is exactly the sort of playing that led to the reaction against playing with your hands not together in the mid-20th century. Every single note is unaligned between right hand and left hand. So, this device, I'm totally in favor of using it. It's a very highly expressive device, but it loses all its meaning when it's applied all the time like this. Now, Nyiregyházi does have a very commanding and rich tone in the left-hand melody, which is wonderful, but I think the signs of his deterioration from a musical point of view are very plain. There's no shading of any kind in this melody. None of the hairpins that Liszt marks. It's an entirely flat line, just loud. Again, it's a caricature of romantic piano playing. The melody has to be loud all the time. Also, his sense of rubato goes beyond the realm of the word rubato into just changing the note values. It's impossible to tell the notated rhythm from what he plays. Like here, there's a dotted eighth and a 16th written, and there's no way you would ever tell that from the way Nyiregyházi plays it. Again, this passage is absurd. The way he plays it, the melody has to be loud, right? Even when Liszt writes sotto voce. Now here, I think this is kind of interesting the way he improvises the left-hand part here, but again, this is way out of proportion. We are in measure 10 of a 216 measure piece, and Nyiregyházi is already playing fortissimo. Liszt hasn't even marked a forte yet, by the way. In fact, he doesn't until measure 120. Do with that what you will. I'm not saying it's wrong to bring these crescendos up to forte before measure 120, but Nyiregyházi isn't showing much of a sense of large-scale planning or structure at all. Yes, this whole build-up is absurd. It's caricatured. There's a huge explosion in the left hand in measure 20. It's so out of proportion. We have so many large climaxes still to come, and Nyiregyházi has already given away his whole sound. That is coupled with this kind of incredibly stuttering, uneven rhythm, 100% unsynchronized hands. It's just practically unlistenable. It's very childish, really, is the only way I can describe it. Again, another bizarrely kind of random move here. He holds the eighth note forever on the pedal. Totally misses the character there, but okay, whatever. So the way he plays this part, the kind of organ interlude, is actually quite interesting. There's a great deal of intensity and richness of sound in what he's doing. I can't help but point out that the rhythm is totally random here that he's playing. He shortens all the long bars with the whole notes, and these are actually the long dissonant notes which are supposed to be held out, and he stretches everything else, so it's very strange musically. Then he drops the silence with the fermata altogether, and that's a big part of what makes this part of the piece so interesting, is the silence, these kind of pregnant pauses in between the ideas, and he doesn't even do it at all. And that's the biggest sign to me that there's something wrong here, because there's a kind of musical arrogance about that, about having to make sound all the time. Now over here in measure 34, he gets a really cool sound on this arpeggio, really, but then immediately after that we're back to this unbearable turgidity of playing. So when this melody repeats, I mean, he plays it in much the same way, with kind of an unbearable flatness and lack of melodic intensity to me, this kind of just static quality. So maybe I'll skip over this part and we can go on to the next section. At this point, for me, the performance starts to seem dreadfully heavy and kind of plodding. He really plays so slowly that the line loses all sense of direction. This passage has a certain interest in the way he plays it, but again, each note is so distended from the one before and after that you don't really get a sense of phrasing at all. It's very note-by-note playing. And again, it seems like he can't stand a moment of silence. He immediately just goes over this rest. Once again, this part is marked by Liszt un poco più di moto, ma sempre lento, dolcissimo, pianissimo. Nyiregyházi plays it exactly the same style as the opening, the exact same tired way of playing every single note with the hands not lining up, still very loud in the melody, not a trace of pianissimo anywhere. This goes quite beyond voicing the melody out and more into the realm of inattention or arrogance, whatever you choose to decide. All right, here we have finally a beautifully played phrase. After 90 bars, he does something really nice here. He reverses the dynamics, and the timing is really very graceful and lovely. So at this point in the performance, Nyiregyházi seems to be on a roll. For me, out of context, this might be one of the better parts of the performance. He plays with a really interesting quality of sound, and I really like his improvisation here. I mean, it doesn't quite fit compared with what he did before, but still, it's very interesting. And unfortunately, I really liked the previous phrase, but this one he kind of ruins it. He is improvising. Maybe he just doesn't remember how the original goes, but he starts to get pretty chaotic here. The left-hand melody is quite different from how Liszt wrote it. I'm all in favor of improv, but this might just be memory slips or kind of bluster. And again, it feels a lot like kind of random unconnected notes being strung out with no particular purpose. This is quite funny because here Liszt marks quasi cadenza, so in a very free manner, but unfortunately Nyiregyházi has been playing in that way already the entire time, so it doesn't sound any different here. In fact, he plays less free in this part, even more strictly plotting and in time. Now, that was actually a very fun little effect, that thunderclap in the bass. That was kind of nice. The way he plays the tremolo in the left hand is really cool. This is an indication that he really was a great pianist at one point. It has a very spine-tingling sound. There's an unfortunate lack of any kind of phrasing in the right hand, though, or the semblance of anything like the notated rhythm, even though I realize it is a cadenza, but still, there should be some relationship to the notated rhythm. And at this point, the insistence on a really slow, kind of dragged out tempo begins to sound more like, I can't play this any faster, rather than an intentional decision. Oh, well, here's a case in point of what I was just talking about. Liszt writes più mosso. Forget about it. We're not going any faster here. Now there's this entirely random explosion in the left hand. I mean, it is marked fortissimo, but we have a lot more of this to come. But then he turns right around and does this really cool sounding thing on the last beat of 130. That's a very elegant solution to a quite awkward passage. Let's hear that one more time. Yeah, that's really cool, I have to say. So this next part is, it's actually kind of interesting. If we just leave aside the fistfuls of random wrong notes, I get the idea he's trying to impart here. Actually very similar to what Vladimir Horowitz did in his recording. He's trying to reinforce all the fortissimo octave descents, get a kind of terrifying sound there. And he does something quite eccentric with the precipitato, the kind of speeding up indication on those octaves. I don't think it's that well executed because it's kind of jerky and out of rhythm, but I get the idea. He does drop bar 138, but that's probably just a memory slip, so no biggie. Okay, so in this part, I hope I'm not alone in thinking that this couldn't be called anywhere near presto, a fast tempo marking, but that's just me, I guess. And at this point, he's really, he's struggling to find the notes. So I won't go on and on about this because I realize he, wasn't practicing at this point, but, it's very labored. And I get that some people would get kind of excited by this, smashing kind of chaotic piano sound, but it doesn't do anything to me. Maybe I'm too familiar with the piano to be affected by that kind of thing. It's a really meretricious effect. Meaning to say, it's kind of bluster. It's substituting in place of actual pianistic ability. He's just kind of throwing big clods of sound at the piano and hoping that no one really notices. So from my point of view, that's kind of insulting to the listener's intelligence. So again, understandable that he hadn't practiced for 40 years, but still, it doesn't make it more palatable to listen to for me anyway. Yeah, again, here, this sounds really spastic, like the poor guy barely remembers how the piece goes. Now, this phrase, he plays very artistically. It really makes me think Nyiregyházi must have been quite a pianist, because he does have all the techniques of a great pianist. It's just kind of unrecognizable beneath all the grime and decay of years of little practice and whatever possible mental disorder he may have been suffering under. Again, I actually really like how he plays this part. It's very appropriate for the mood of utter exhaustion. Unfortunately, he's kind of been playing this way the whole time, but here it actually works. Now, this is one of my favorite passages in the piece, but I really don't like his playing here. It's, again, very loud and unphrased in the melody. And he also doesn't really choose very carefully where to add extra bass notes in the bass, extra octaves lower. He basically just plops an extra bass note an octave lower everywhere that he possibly can. It just sounds random. Also, there's so much pedaling. He blurs so many harmonies together, which, again, can be a very beautiful effect to blur two harmonies together. But the way he's doing it, it just turns into this cloud of mush. It's really hard to even hear the progressions sometimes. So I think he's not really doing justice to Liszt's very beautiful harmonies here. So again, there's kind of a hint of something greater here. A beautiful sound, some nice effects. It's a little obscured by heavy pedaling and a too lugubrious tempo, but still, I mean, it's interesting playing. Again, the constant left hand first effect and the kind of bombs on the left hand where he fills out all the left hand octaves, they really strike me as bluster and just empty, shallow effect. Also, I just want to say that Nyiregyházi actually can create a very loud, rich sound, but he also sometimes is very harsh. Like these G sharps, repeated G sharps at the end of 195, those sound very harsh and overplayed to me. This passage, which is again one of the most beautiful in the entire piece, Nyiregyházi just makes a complete cataclysm here because he's pedaling through all the harmony changes. So and he's playing, like 50 wrong notes for every right one. So I guess it's up to each person to decide if that makes it sound inspiring and like he's struggling against physical reality, or if it's just like a huge mess. For me, I opt for the second option. All right, so this is maybe the most horrible yet. This continues to kind of butcher this extremely beautiful section of the music. The way he smacks the right-hand octaves here and some of the left-hand chords, barely playing the notes, is very ugly. I mean, at this point, it's just purely ugly and inartistic. And in one of the most beautiful passages in the piece. It's really just makes me gape. And this is the best part yet. These two bizarrely unpedaled staccato notes at the end of the bar with no sense of connection to what came before or what's coming up next. Just truly awful. Yeah, so this whole section, I mean, he does this a lot through the piece. I guess he's getting excited or something. He just plays like a random collection of notes in the left hand to sound like a bomb going off. Again, kind of meretricious effect. It gets old very quickly. Yeah, this is all grotesque. There's no trace at all of sempre animando al fine here. I do think that people generally try to speed up too much here, but Nyiregyházi is just wallowing in all this ugly sound. And then, of course, there is this last coda part, the ritenuto part. It's not really obvious that he's even slowing down, of course, because everything has been so slow up to this point. And again, every single note is kind of separated from every other note around it. There's no connection between anything, no phrasing, nothing really holding the line together. Just sounds like basically random notes played loudly. So that about sums it up. Personally, I think this is one of the most horrible piano recordings I've ever heard. Notwithstanding, though, moments of great interest and beauty here and there, a couple of them anyway. But I'm sure there are people who disagree with me. I know some people really love this performance, and I'd love to hear, what you think about it. Probably we could get into some good-natured arguments about this in the comment section. And of course, there's no right or wrong answer here, because some people are really going to love this kind of stuff and some people are not. It's a subjective matter, of course. But I'd love to hear your reasoning if you do really like this performance, why and what things about it you like. If there's sufficient interest, I might come back and do a much more positive video on his performance of the Liszt Legend No. 1 and some of those other late Liszt pieces that I mentioned that I actually quite liked. So in the meantime, thanks for watching and for your patience, and I'll be back next week with some more performance videos. I've got some more good music coming up in the next couple of weeks, so stay tuned for that. Thank you again for watching, and thank you for all my Patreon supporters. I couldn't do this project without you, so thank you so much for supporting the channel. Until next time, take care.